When Scooby-Doo Where Are You was in production, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid was one of the top Hollywood films in release. Guess what? Butch and Sundance die at the end. Now that you're reeling from that spoiler, all the ones for the episodes featured in this video won't feel so bad now, will they? Following an uninvited guest in the Mystery Machine to a spooky house in the middle of nowhere, the gang come face to face with a ghost of a famous Victorian-era monster. In the Scooby-Doo universe, the Scoobyverse, the Scooby-Dooniverse, Robert Louis Stevenson's characters Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde apparently actually existed, with one of the infamous Doctor's great-grandchildren using the family legacy as a cover for his jewel thefts. Mad science doesn't seem to be a very well-paying gig these days, as evidenced by Dr. Jekyll's dilapidated house and lab, although somehow he was still able to afford a live-in housekeeper. Then again, considering how unkempt the place was, Dr. Jekyll was either not paying her, or she was merely the best he could afford. His failure to produce any marketable results with his science seems to have made the Doctor desperate enough to resort to crime. Considering he thought choosing a monster that was inextricably linked to his family as a disguise might explain why he wasn't very good at the science stuff. Seriously, if you're going to start committing robberies, the last thing you want to do is make people think of your name when discussing the particulars. That's like having the last name Frankenstein and deciding to steal cars by dressing up with a flat top and bolts glued to your neck. Dr. Jekyll also recklessly targeted jewelers housed in tall buildings, requiring him to dangerously scale the outside of these structures using nothing but suction cups. Cartoon physics aside, he was one overlooked crack in the concrete wall away from painful injury or death. About the only aspect of the crime to which Dr. Jekyll did seem to give some thought was framing his housekeeper for his actions. Considering her gruff attitude and how filthy the house and lab were, I can't help but wonder if perhaps the housekeeper and her employer had an adversarial relationship, and this entire scheme was really just the Doctor's way of getting revenge against her. We never see the state of the Doctor's refrigerator, but I can't help but lament that Helga the housekeeper wasn't Italian with metallic orange hair and named Alina. This plan of Dr. Jekyll's stupidly used his famous family name as a cover, had little to no planning apart from setting up a patsy, and was extremely high risk both in terms of getting caught and falling to one's death from the side of a multi-story building. The only positive in his plan is how lucrative jewel theft could be if successfully executed. He gets a 2 out of 5. Once again, Hanna-Barbera went back to early Hollywood for inspiration, as the Stevenson novel Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde had by that point seen dozens of stage, radio, film, and television adaptations. As with the previous depiction of the Yeti, for some reason this version of Mr. Hyde is treated as a ghost and not a transformed man, despite never showing off any actual ghost powers or the usual ghost features like glowing or transparency. There's one mention of phosphorus paint, but this monster never appears to wear any.
A ghost!
I'm starting to take exception with how the Scooby writers seem to toss the word ghost around as a catch-all for any supernatural shenanigans. It's like how people of a certain generation used to describe everything related to video games as a Nintendo. The closest Mr. Hyde ever came to exhibiting any supernatural abilities was how he was able to effortlessly scale buildings, but climbing walls is usually what happens to the victims of a ghost. I will give Dr. Jekyll credit for how creepy his Mr. Hyde outfit was. The green skin and cloak are nothing new, but the odd choice of using a bucket hat feels somewhat original. And that face is certainly perverted enough to represent the dark half of the human soul. Though when looking at the contents of Dr. Jekyll's bookcase and the bottle of knockout drops the gang find later, that perverted face may not be just a disguise. Like the ghost of Captain Cutler and the Space Kook, Mr. Hyde does seem to have hit a certain nerve in the Scooby fandom, so despite the lack of originality, I'll still give him a 3.5 out of 5 for the outfit. If the only time we see Dr. Jekyll committing one of his jewel thefts on screen is any indication, he clearly spent little time planning the heists. His modus operandi seemed to be climbing tall buildings looking for conveniently unlocked exterior windows of rooms filled with jewelry, stealing a single piece, and laughing hysterically while descending, guaranteeing at least one witness seeing him in the act before fleeing on foot. Considering he didn't have any burglary tools on him, the entire robbery itself hinged on the lax security of whichever building he was targeting. This makes his efforts seem even more slipshod, as dialogue indicated he had been staging his Mr. Hyde jewel theft for some time, and you'd think the town's jewelers would have beefed up their security. If there's a cat burglar targeting people like you should at least spring for a lock on your window. Dr. Jekyll also didn't have a getaway car or any accomplices to help him escape. His plan seemed to be to just run away while conspicuously holding his loot in his hands while looking for an unlocked vehicle in which to hide. No pun intended. In a stroke of luck, Dr. Jekyll just happened to pick the mystery machine to conceal himself, and Fred's spooky shortcut home just happened to be in the direction of Dr. Jekyll's house, and when they stopped in a panic after finding Mr. Hyde in their vehicle, it just happened to be within walking distance to his place. It is interesting to see the monster turn the tables on the gang for a change by being the one doing the trespassing. Though again, getting involved with Scooby and his friends is the worst thing that can happen if you're in the middle of a supernaturally themed criminal enterprise. At least this time, the villain had a good reason not to call the police to remove the kids, as they saw him enter the house as Mr. Hyde and would easily lead the authorities to him. Helga was also aware of the gang's involvement, so unless Dr. Jekyll planned on murdering 5 people and a talking dog, he had to pin all his hopes on framing his housekeeper. After Shaggy found the suction cups that would prove Helga's innocence, Dr. Jekyll pulled a Daphne maneuver and abducted him. But what exactly was he going to do at that point? What was his plan with Shaggy on the table? He insinuates that he's going to turn the teenager into a frog, but Mr. Hyde isn't really a ghost who can do that. In fact, that's not even a ghost thing. That's a witch thing. Dr. Jekyll would have been better off just holding a pillow over Shaggy's face until he stopped kicking. But lacking the resolve to do that, he should have just grabbed as much of his stolen loot as possible, hot-wired the mystery machine, and drove out of state, because his plot to frame someone else for his crime was already foiled.
And when he figured he might be caught, he came up with the idea of framing Helga the maid.
Shame on you, Dr. Jekyll.
I'm going to dispute this for several reasons, as Dr. Jekyll's attempt to frame Helga was not spur of the moment. Let's look at the various clues he left to implicate the housekeeper. First, his dried muddy shoes. The implication is that Helga had drugged the doctor and dressed him in those shoes to make him think he was just outside in the marsh, but as they were dry, he couldn't have been out there. It takes time for mud to dry, so Dr. Jekyll must have had those shoes ready to go long before the gang showed up. Second, the burned remains of the newspaper clippings in the fireplace. Fred was digging through the ashes in his bare hands, meaning they were cold, so whatever fire had been in there had to have gone out hours earlier. Third, the feather duster and second set of muddy shoes. Velma says they just saw Dr. Jekyll reading in his study, meaning they've been keeping track of his location. So those items had to have been stashed away much earlier than thought. Even Dr. Jekyll's decision to scale buildings the way he did suggests that he chose that method knowing of Helga's history as a circus star specializing in climbing. These were all attempts to frame the housekeeper set up well in advance of the gang's arrival, which just seems to add further evidence to my earlier suggestion that this entire plot was less about stealing jewelry and more about getting Helga arrested for a crime she didn't commit. But why? I have a theory. Perhaps there was a dark reason behind Dr. Jekyll's actions. Is it possible that he continued to employ Helga despite how badly she did her job because he had a romantic interest in her? Feelings that would have turned negative if she had spurned his advances? Kinda puts that book on the shelf and the bottle of knockout drops in a whole new disturbing light, doesn't it? Those, and the fact that Dr. Jekyll had his back door rigged with a trap door to catch any unwitting visitors, paints a potentially grim picture of what could be one of the more secretly sinister Scooby villains.
And if our calculations are right, it should be Helga, the housemaid.
Dr. Jekyll!
Dr. Jekyll gets a low mark for the jewel robberies themselves, but high marks for how well he framed Helga, because even Velma was convinced it was her until the unmasking. 3 out of 5. The Ghost of Mr. Hyde finishes with a do score of 2.8 out of 5. Incidentally, while making this video, I learned that the original proper pronunciation of the name Jekyll was really Jekyll. But these days, who would pronounce it like that? That's like saying skier instead of scare, or treasure instead of treasure. Who designed this house? Sarah Winchester?
If you don't sign the treaty, running dog, we'll take back the trinkets and beads.
I really wish I could say this is the most culturally insensitive moment in Scooby-Doo Where Are You? Stay tuned for my next segment. While in San Francisco to celebrate the Chinese New Year, Daphne makes an impulse buy that, what else, gets her kidnapped, leading to the gang disrupting an international smuggling ring in Chinatown.
It's Chinatown.
Okay, try to wrap your head around this. Chinese art dealer Mr. Fong was the head of a smuggling cartel where each month he would be sent a jeweled mask reproduction which would be hiding a tape recording containing the details of their incoming illegal shipments, which would then be transcribed to smaller pieces of paper to be sent to the rest of their gang by carrier pigeon. Carrier pigeons. In 1970. I know this was long before the internet and cell phones, but wow. At the time, landline telephones, CB radios, and secret codes existed. If Mr. Fong was afraid of having their communications intercepted by law enforcement, there's even a thing called a courier who could have gone around the country personally delivering instructions.
The more they overthink the plumbing, the easier it is to stop up the drain.
As Mr. Scott so eloquently explained, the more complicated you make a scheme, the easier it becomes for it to unravel. In Mr. Fong's case, all it took was one wrong delivery in his Columbia House Mask of the Month Club for the entire operation to fall apart. He probably should have used UPS for his deliveries rather than the local post office in Chinatown.
It's Chinatown.
The supernatural aspect of this caper was little more than the bad guys dressing up in vaguely spooky outfits to discourage snoopers and didn't really play much part in anything. I'm giving their design a 2.5 out of 5. Smuggling is lucrative, but there had to have been a less convoluted way of going about it. To frighten people away from their Chinese temple hideout, Mr. Fong's henchmen wore ghost masks that didn't appear to be inspired by anything traditionally Chinese. At the beginning of the episode, Fong himself wore robes that hid his face, but was nothing inherently supernatural. It wasn't until they kidnapped Daphne and stole the Zen 12 mask that he wore the full disguise, implying it was a last-minute idea on his part. I don't understand why the gang were scared by the henchmen initially. Remember, they were only there in the first place to watch the Chinese New Year festivities, so shouldn't they have assumed the henchmen were wearing costumes for the celebration? After all, Shaggy and Scooby weren't hiding in fear from the dragon prominently displayed in the parade. But then again, being surrounded by happy festival goers is a lot different than being accosted by two large men on an empty street in Chinatown.
It's Chinatown.
None of the disguises were that impressive and featured no special effects that would make them look like anything other than three guys wearing robes. 1 out of 5. Say it with me. Kidnapping is the worst thing you can do to scare off meddling kids. Though a high-speed chase through the surprisingly deserted streets of San Francisco is also a poor way to maintain a low profile. I mentioned before how needlessly complicated Mr. Fong's smuggling ring was, and we saw in the episode how easily it failed. However, it was successful enough that despite suspecting Mr. Fong as the mastermind, the authorities had been unable to secure any evidence to arrest him until the gang got involved.
I do know the mystery. The golden mask was stolen many centuries ago from the crypt of the great warlord Zen Tuo.
Right here, Mr. Fong would have saved himself a lot of hassle and probably his entire smuggling ring had he simply taken that moment to remove the evidence that he was involved. While holding the mask, it would have been very easy to excuse himself from the room, saying something like, "I'll be right back, I need to get my magnifying glasses," and while out of sight, pop open the secret compartment, take out the tape, then return to the gang and say literally anything that would get them to leave. This is a reproduction of the grave mask of the warlord Zen Tuo. It's a nice tourist piece, but not worth that much money. I have no idea why those men tried to take it from you. It was probably just a petty street crime. Chinatown is very big, so I doubt you'll see them again. Have a nice day. Then all Mr. Fong would have to do is order his henchmen to leave Daphne alone. Done. No more clues for the gang to follow. They would have nothing to lead them to the smuggler's temple hideout. Scooby and the rest would eventually go home with no more than a vague unease about the attempted mugging. But hey, it's Chinatown.
It's Chinatown.
A further mistake in claiming the mask was genuine is that Mr. Fong seemed to have forgotten that he had been operating under the guise of being a legitimate art dealer. This means if someone brought him what was supposed to have been a stolen cultural artifact, wouldn't he have been duty-bound to immediately contact the authorities, and if the gang refused to stick around until investigators arrived, detain them? That's the difference between being a respectable art collector and a common thief. Obviously, he couldn't afford to have the fake mask wind up in the hands of the police, so perhaps that was why Mr. Fong felt it was smarter to let Daphne keep it until his henchmen could steal it later. But this only makes it worse that he claimed it was a legitimate piece in the first place and didn't take the recording when he had the chance.
Don't you know it's illegal to shoot off fireworks and wreck a storeroom?
We will build a new storeroom.
Mr. Fong's decision to kill Shaggy and Scooby using a pile of fireworks is also highly questionable. He dismisses their legitimate observation about destroying the storeroom by glibly telling them he'd build a new one, which is not a bad Bond villain type line, but if the whole point of the masks and kidnapping Daphne and trapping Fred and Velma was to protect their secret hideout, wouldn't setting off a large explosion defeat the purpose? Certainly fireworks were already being set off during the New Year celebration, but those were one or two at a time, not a massive pile that would result in major damage to a building in a populated area. The temple in the hills isn't in the middle of nowhere. They're still in the city. You can see buildings in the background. Somebody is going to report hearing an explosion. Or maybe not. After all, it's Chinatown.
It's Chinatown.
For forgetting his cover as an art dealer, making the fundamental mistake in drawing the gang to their hideout by kidnapping Daphne, and choosing a way to kill Shaggy and Scooby in the most attention-grabbing way possible, Mr. Fong and his gang get a 2 out of 5 for the operation. This leaves him with a do score of 1.8 out of 5.
Perhaps you would be interested in this golden mask.
No thanks. Clown faces are more my bag.
Clown faces are more my bag. What? I'm no auto mechanic, but if your tires are bald enough to skid on a banana peel, it's probably time to look into replacing them.
A bibs for the boo boys. Mustn't get dirty, you know. Here's the specialty of the house. Chocolate chop suey and spell ribber a la mode. If you want anything else, just go...
Jesus Christ, Hanna-Barbera!
It's Chinatown.
Proving that it is literally impossible for the gang to enjoy a day off, Shaggy hooks a frozen caveman while fishing, only for it to come to life and chase them around a local ocean area. Professor Wayne, a researcher at the Oceanland Sea Aquarium, plots to steal a revolutionary invention created by his fellow scientist, Professor Engstrom. Instead of sneaking a peek at the plans and rushing to file a patent before the legitimate inventor, Professor Wayne hatches a kidnapping plot to claim it as his own. It's too bad that Professor Engstrom wasn't a woman, because then Professor Wayne could have simply stolen all the credit and the scientific community wouldn't have batted an eye. Using the convenient fact that a frozen prehistoric caveman was recently lost at sea, Professor Wayne dressed up a dummy as the caveman, froze it in a block of ice, and set it adrift so it would float to Oceanland. Presumably, he would have been on hand to retrieve it along with Professor Engstrom had Shaggy not hooked it while fishing. From there, Professor Wayne would melt the ice, don the caveman disguise, and go on a rampage to cover up his abduction of Professor Engstrom and his theft of the latter's brilliant new invention. There is one extremely major flaw in this plan: the original real frozen caveman.
Like, what would have happened if I hadn't hooked that prehistoric ice cube?
With the prevailing current, it would have drifted down to Oceanland anyhow.
This dialogue implies that it was only a matter of time before the real caveman would end up at Oceanland, meaning Professor Wayne was working against the clock. What would he have done if the real caveman showed up before the fake one, or even at any point afterward? This would have immediately ruined his scheme. Is it possible that Professor Wayne already found the real caveman and got rid of it so it wouldn't interfere with his plans? If you're okay with kidnapping and intellectual property theft, what's a little historical desecration, right? Despite ignoring the more obvious method of achieving his goal and making things more complicated than needed, this was still an original plan. So I'll give Professor Wayne a 3.5 out of 5. As far as costumes go, there wasn't anything that special about the caveman. At least, not on the surface. Professor Wayne's disguise was authentic, but not supernatural. A frozen Homo erectus being revived is more science gone wrong than vengeful spirit from beyond the grave. The fear the caveman instilled in the gang was more akin to what one would experience if running into a dangerous animal that wandered into an urban setting. I mentioned the authenticity of the disguise, however, at the risk of being pedantic, there is one point that Professor Wayne got wrong. The frozen caveman was said to have been 2 million years old, placing him near the beginning of the Homo erectus species, while it's estimated that humans didn't start to wear clothes until less than 200,000 years ago. Barney Rubble here should have been naked, so let's be thankful for once that the Scooby writers were so bad at history.
7 days a week, you've even got me talking in my sleep.
I'm no maritime expert, but an anchor of that size likely weighs at least 200 pounds. That's not including the weight of the rope either. The caveman picked it up with one hand and tossed it dozens of feet to hook Shaggy and Scooby. We know it's not a fake anchor made of styrofoam because it drops on the caveman's foot with a loud metallic clang. Did Professor Wayne have a hidden hydraulic system built into the costume to give it superhuman strength? That could explain how a skinny man like him was able to fill the inside of the bulky suit without wearing any padding. Presumably, Scooby took out all that heavy machinery before dancing with the empty suit at the end of the episode. Had Professor Wayne actually built such a powerful costume, he certainly would have received a high outfit score, but as we all know, this was just another example of wonky Scooby Show physics. So he gets a tepid 2.5 out of 5. The amount of work Professor Wayne went through to steal his fellow scientist's invention is a testament to his determination, if nothing else, despite overthinking what should have been simple intellectual property theft and a series of errors in judgment. Looking at the initial appearance as the caveman, where he staged his own abduction, Professor Wayne illustrated both the savagery and primitive nature of the monster by making it appear to have destroyed the door to escape the freezer. However, the gang should have known right here they were dealing with an imposter when the caveman correctly opened the door they were hiding behind, because I'm pretty sure they didn't have doorknobs in the Stone Age. Those guys don't count. Though we never see it happen, and the timing itself is suspect as the caveman appears almost immediately after Professor Ingstrom runs into the shack, what was Professor Wayne going to do after kidnapping his coworker? Let's think about this. He kidnapped Professor Ingstrom to steal the marine life communicator. Fine, but then what? Let's say he goes to the patent office and files his claim. This isn't a quick process. It can take years for a new invention to be approved. Was he going to keep Professor Ingstrom hidden in a shack all that time? Considering how he tried killing Shaggy, Velma, and Scooby, Professor Wayne was probably going to murder Professor Ingstrom as well, because if he ever escaped, it wouldn't take long to prove the caveman was fake and who was wearing the disguise. Speaking of murder, the whole escapade on the fishing boat raises some questions. For starters, why was the boat still out there in the first place? If Professor Wayne owned it outright, he would have already had a marina or dock somewhere for it to have been regularly stored. If he rented it, there's an owner out there somewhere filing a police report over his missing property. If he was afraid of the ice machine being used as evidence against him, why not just dump it overboard? Or even scuttle the boat in the middle of the ocean? He must have already had another seacraft available, since he certainly didn't swim back to land. As for his actual attempt to kill the kids, why try to crush them by turning on the ice machine? Even if you ignore the fact that all the teens would have had to do was, turn off the machine, they could have easily escaped by simply stacking the blocks of ice in front of the locked door and then just let the machine keep creating ice until it forced the door open. This wasn't ocean land, and they were trapped on the boat with nowhere to hide. Professor Wayne should have just beat them to death with his club. I'm giving him a 3 out of 5 for his follow-through. Professor Wayne showed dedication to his scheme and successfully carried out much of it, but he stumbled when it came to dealing with the meddling kids. This gives the Frozen Caveman a do score of 3 out of 5 as well. For a more detailed examination of this episode, please check out my video where I compare it to John Carpenter's The Thing. While en route to a barn dance, the Mystery Machine comes across what appears at first to be an accident, but is really the work of the Creeper, a phantom who had been robbing a local bank and now has his sights set on the Scooby Gang. Bank President Mr. Carswell invented the Creeper to cover up his embezzlement. As the last one to leave the bank every night, he would help himself to the contents of the vault, then come back later in costume to make it look like a phantom was responsible for the missing money. This wasn't the best of plans. As the bank president, Mr. Carswell would have eventually been held responsible for not preventing the robberies, so phantom or not, it wouldn't take long for the bank's board of directors to replace him. With no longer having access to the vault, this would immediately put an end to the Creeper's crimes and make the former president look extremely suspicious. It's also unlikely that federal investigators would accept robbed by a phantom who can walk through walls as a legitimate explanation for the missing money, and would no doubt interrogate everyone involved, from the tellers and bank guards all the way up to the president. They would also no doubt look into the finances of every employee, and it wouldn't take long to figure out who was spending more than their salary covered. Looking back at the Redbeard episode, C.L. Magnus claimed that one of his ancestors earned the hatred of the notorious pirate, which would explain why his ghost only targeted ships owned by the Magnus Company. Here, there was no explanation given as to why the Creeper would only be targeting Mr. Carswell's bank, making it even more likely that the crime was an inside job. Even Buck Masters threw everyone off his scent by kidnapping more than just his own dog. The fact that the bank guard installed the camera without telling his boss implies he already had his suspicions about Mr. Carswell, meaning it was probably only a matter of time before the rake of justice smacked the bank president in the face. Everything points to this as being a very risky and very poorly thought out scheme. 1.5 out of 5. The only reason Mr. Carswell gets that extra half point is because of the amount of money involved. The Creeper is another one of the classic Scooby-Doo villains that occasionally pops up in other films and series, but as for the disguise itself, there's not much to it. A rubber mask, green painted skin, and a matching green trench coat and slacks is nothing to write home about. The Creeper looks like nothing more than a bargain bin Frankenstein costume that couldn't even be bothered to include bolts for the neck. Despite being described as a phantom who could walk through walls, at no point in the episode did the Creeper exhibit anything supernatural. Apart from the usual Scooby-Doo villain superhuman feats of strength, like pushing over a massive tree, ripping apart a car, and being an overweight man no younger than his mid-50s, yet able to keep pace with 4 teenagers and their dog in the prime of physical condition. If we're going to be brutally honest, the Creeper doesn't look that much different than the ghost of Mr. Hyde featured just 2 episodes earlier, and Mr. Hyde was at least able to accessorize. This was a mostly uninspired villain disguise that showed just how much the Scooby-Doo producers were already struggling to find ways to keep their bad guys fresh. 2 out of 5, and I'm being generous. As we've already seen in earlier episodes, even if you're a villain who starts out with a brilliant scheme, it can still be difficult successfully executing it. So when your plot is already bad, you're likely doomed to struggle. What exactly was Mr. Carswell looking for when he ransacked the guard's car? Obviously the film negatives that showed his guilt because they were found later torn up, but he somehow missed the very large piece of paper the guard was furiously clutching during the assault? We learned later that after they left the unconscious guard at Mr. Carswell's house, the bank president tied his employee up and stashed him in his basement, presumably to prevent him from going to the police. What was Mr. Carswell's endgame? Paper or not, there were 4 witnesses who could testify the missing man was left in Mr. Carswell's care. The game was up at this point, and his only hope to remain free was to go on the run. As the Creeper, Mr. Carswell did little more than chase the gang trying to get the incriminating paper back, just like how Dr. Najib ran after them trying to get the coin. Both villains even limited their speech to the object they were pursuing. Coin, coin, paper, paper. The Creeper was so ineffective, the gang didn't even need to set a trap for him. He was caught by accident, which is never a good sign when rating the quality of a Scooby villain's actions. Although if anything, the Scooby Gang end up looking the worst in this episode. Not only do they inadvertently deliver a helpless, injured victim to his attacker, assault each other, follow the wrong set of footprints, almost accuse an innocent hermit of being the bad guy, and everybody but Scooby gets trapped in the end along with the monster, look what they did to that poor farmer who was nice enough to let their high school have a dance on his property. They litter. They disturb the sleeping farmer and his family, smash a window in his house, damage his silo, steal one of his horses and carriage, wreck the carriage, and abandon the horse. This is the last time that farmer is going to allow any high school to host a dance at his place, that's for certain. But this is not a Rank the Meddling Kids video, so we'll leave it at that. We'll also leave the Creeper with a 1 out of 5 for the operation. This gives Mr. Carswell a do score of 1.5 out of 5. This low score surprised me considering how iconic the Creeper is as a Scooby villain. But objectively speaking, he was pathetic.
The Creeper.
The Creeper?
The Reaper? May I run in?
Well, I've been a wallflower before, but this is ridiculous.
Wow, 40 years before Mystery Incorporated, and Scooby was already blocking Velma.
Now all that's left is to take these paper plates out back. We can dump them by that ugly scarecrow, Scoob.
Were they really just gonna dump their trash outside? Somebody call Woodsy the Owl.
Unknown to Carswell, the guard installed a concealed infrared camera which took a picture of him robbing the bank.
Concealed camera.
He's a phantom. A phantom that can walk right through walls.
I have to say the Scooby series was ahead of its time when it comes to representation. I mean, here we have a villain who was missing a leg, but was still able to perform his bad guy duties just as well as his more able-bodied contemporaries. And that's the first half of my villain ranking for Season 2 of Scooby-Doo Where Are You? Here are the current results, and I hope to see you soon for the second half. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I also enjoy reading comments, so it'd be great if you left one below. Nice comments, obviously. Don't be mean.